For this next session, I'd like for us to imagine, what could we do? If we could move beyond only thinking about the 9% and stewarding out of my paycheck, and by contrast, expand our vision to consider stewarding out of my assets, what could happen? How could that impact my family and my church? A portion maybe of my IRA or 401k when I die. When I'm selling my company, maybe I carve off 10% as a tithe and do it pre-tax. Therefore, I save taxes and get money into kingdom stuff instead of unnecessary taxes. What if I could reduce or eliminate the largest tax bill of my life in favor of legacy? What could we do individually and as a family? And how could we create a family legacy? But also, what could we do as a church, as a local church, and as a global church? Because we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, even trillions of dollars that are at stake here. But we must stop the leakage. Now, remember what I said in the beginning, in session 1, God is not wringing his hands. He will get his work done with us or without us. I spoke at a conference in Singapore years ago and on world evangelization, and all the fantastic ministries that are involved in the Great Commission were there. Billy Graham, Campus Crusade, YWAM, Wycliffe, Southern Baptist, on and on and on. Great organizations. I was there to speak on this issue of funding mission, and I sat in the back of the room while I listened to each of these speakers talk about their mission, their strategy, their plan, and how they had structured it, and what the cost was going to be to fulfill the Great Commission. And as we looked at that, as I listened, I was keeping track of all these great leaders as they were speaking, and how much would the total cost be if all of these organizations did their thing with some obvious overlap, but collectively, in total, what would the budget be? And as we estimated this, I added up, and it was less than $40 billion. Now, 40 billion is not a small amount of money, I'm not saying that, but when we're talking about 40 billion versus tapping into hundreds of billions or even trillions, it's a breath, it's a vapor, it's nothing. So I'd like for you to stretch your imagination and think, what could we do as a family? What could we do as a local church? And what could we do as a global church? What is possible in terms of impact? To set the stage for that, I want to tell you a story. In 1443, toward the end of the 100-year war between England and France, in the city of Beaune in Burgundy region, we find Chancellor Nicholas Roland, the Duke's chancellor. He's watching this war-torn area of France that he and his wife live in, and they're making the observation that only the wealthy have health care. The peasants spend a lifetime living in squalor, and then they die in squalor. And this touched their hearts. He and his wife thought, and they prayed, and they considered, and they finally decided over time that they would build a hospital, the two of them. They sold some of the vineyards that they had, and they took the proceeds and built a hospital, Hôtel Dieu, which means hostel of God. The purpose of the hospital was to serve the poor, free of charge, no cost. Well, as the hospital got going, the gift and commitment of Chancellor Roland and his wife touched the hearts of people in the region to follow suit, to follow their example, and it became a ripple effect. Their generosity inspired others who in turn gave to the hospital some of their land, their vineyards, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The result, Hôtel Dieu served the poor free of charge, nonstop, from 1443 to the late 1970s, over 500 years. All because of one couple taking the initiative, not simply to tithe the fruit of their vineyards, but rather to give the vineyard itself. They gave out of their assets and not simply the fruit. It's critically important in the Barnabas story in Acts 4, and also the one of Nicholas Roland in the 15th century France, that in those cases, they could sell the farm, their vineyard, and pay no taxes. In our system in 21st century America, if you've owned a vineyard or a widget company or apartment building for several decades, you're going to pay long-term capital gain tax. So we would say, hit the pause button, don't sell it, and then give the after-tax proceeds, or give a portion of the after-tax proceeds, but rather carve out a chunk of the apartment building or your family business or whatever you choose, and give that before you sell it. And then you're going to have two benefits and not just one. So we would say, stop, hit the pause button before you sell that apartment building or a piece of your business or whatever appreciated asset you're talking about. Before you sell it, pay taxes, and then give out of the cash, decide that you want to give whatever percent it is for you, let's say 10%. Give that 10% before the sale. Now you're going to have two tax benefits. That portion that you gave will be sold tax-free, and you're still going to get a fair market value deduction on that 10%. Two tax benefits instead of one. Now, if we can apply that to this 91% across your family and your church and the body of Christ, we're talking about massive difference in terms of kingdom impact by using smart stewardship instead of just rolling down the path we've been on for 100 years. Let's get some perspective on this stewarding assets, and we're going to look at the Old Testament now. In Exodus 25, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to bring me an offering. You are to receive the offering from me from each man whose heart prompts him to give. These are the offerings you are to receive from them: gold, silver, bronze, blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, fine linen, goat hair, ram skins, and so on and so on and so on." Now, this is to build the first tabernacle, and they're wandering around in the desert here for 40 years. This is kind of like the first church capital campaign. Now, what's interesting about this is these things they're giving were given to them. If we go back to Exodus 12, Exodus 12, verse 35, this is great. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. Now that's pretty interesting here. This is wealth. These are assets that they didn't have when they were slaves. But as they're leaving Egypt, God, through Moses, tells the Israelites to go to their neighbors and ask them. And so all of a sudden they're leaving Egypt with all kinds of stuff, gold and silver and purple yarn and so on. And by the way, that's an interesting thing. When I think about giving my assets, am I giving what I have worked hard for my whole life? Am I stewarding a piece of what I have worked hard for my entire lifetime? Or am I giving what God has blessed me with? Yes and yes. The answer is yes to both. Let's look at a different passage over in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 8:17 says, "You may say to yourself, 'My power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me.' But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth and so confirms His covenant, which He swore to your forefathers as it is today." So, we are giving what God has blessed us with and what we have also worked very hard for. So in Exodus 25, we have God instructing the Israelites through Moses to build a tabernacle with resources they got back in Exodus 12 and things that God gave them strength to create, as we can see through the passage in Deuteronomy. But let's fast forward now to Exodus 36. Verse 4 says, "So all the skilled craftsmen who were doing all the work on the sanctuary left their work and said to Moses, 'The people are bringing more than enough for doing the work the Lord commanded to be done.'" The people are bringing more than enough. More than enough. Imagine if your church wanted to expand your impact for the cause of Christ and attack an issue: poverty, foster care, reaching the lost in your community or in a foreign country, sex trafficking, whatever you set your hands to do. But now, for the first time, we've turned off that spigot of leakage and perhaps we have more than enough. I'd encourage you individually and as a leadership in the church to think, what could we do in our community? How could we grow the youth group? How could we impact widows and the poor in our community? How could we impact evangelism on the other side of the planet? What could happen in our church and on the other side of the world if we understand and engage in stewarding not just our cash, but also the 91%? Could we have more than enough?